My sermon today is the second of three sermons that I will give that come directly out of my sabbatical experience. The first was about the Quaker group that I lived with for 5 months in Mexico City, and I came to appreciate them in such a special way. And I call this learning a delightful surprise. The third sermon will be in late February. It will be about immigration, and more specifically, it will be about refugees, and specifically refugees in Mexico, but I'll relate it to refugee crisis in the United States as well. And this was clearly a significant learning for me. Today's sermon I am calling Peace Begins in the Heart. As many of you know, I had this belief, this deeply held belief, that peace begins in the heart before I went on sabbatical. But my time away, and this is the value of a sabbatical, my time away gave me the opportunity to consider this belief and practice more fully, much more fully, and to examine nonviolent communication more thoroughly. As I had hoped, this was the most profound experience of my sabbatical. I want to explain why I believe that peace begins in the heart. I've always been interested in justice work, but I found that some, and perhaps many people in social justice work, are angry. And I get that anger. It's horribly frustrating to see all of the injustices in the world. It is difficult. Here is the rub for me. From time to time, I see groups with whom I agree on the justice issue, but I see those groups vilifying others with whom we disagree. I find it incongruous to be speaking about justice and peace while claiming that others are the villains. In July 2010 in Phoenix, Arizona, I and a ministerial colleague went to our knees in prayer and meditation rather than participate in chants vilifying others. I understand the anger. The issue was immigration. I understand the anger that was expressed towards Joe Arpaio, the sheriff in Phoenix, Arizona. But calling him Satan and other things was not something I could personally participate in. And a colleague and I went to our knees in meditation. We wanted to be supportive, but not in the way that it was being expressed. It seems to me that we cannot be about creating a better world, a more peaceful world, while our hearts are in such disarray. It seems to me that we would have a more powerful message if we work from a more peaceful place in our hearts. And finally, and I really think this is the most important part, I believe it is difficult to work for justice and peace without also working for peace in our congregations, peace in our homes, and peace in our own thoughts, because too often our thoughts will take us in a place we don't want to go. And being as transparent with you as I can, I want you to know that I take to heart the teachings of Jesus, who taught us to love even and especially those who persecute you. That is a profound, profound teaching. And so it is my belief that peace begins in the heart. I want to remind you of the challenge that I issued before I went on sabbatical. I said that sabbaticals are an opportunity for spiritual and personal growth on the part of the minister. And I challenged you, the congregation, to use my 5 months away to consider what personal and spiritual growth looks like for you. For those who heard and accepted my challenge, I would love to hear about your experience. Please share that with me. I want to be clear at the outset, during my sabbatical, I didn't have some spiritual breakthrough. I didn't come back a significantly changed person. And yet change is inevitable. And I do come back with renewed vigor for the belief that how we treat one another is fundamentally important. And it is the starting place for any other work we do. And I want to share that enthusiasm with you today. Let me offer a little background. My journey with this work took a significant step forward 5.5 years ago when I first came to Emerson to serve as your minister. I actually came here right after that experience in Phoenix, Arizona. I was in Phoenix, Arizona in July 2010, and I started serving as the minister of this congregation in August. At that time, Emerson was doing introductory work in nonviolent communication, or NVC, using a video by NVC founder Marshall Rosenberg. I joined you in that work. It really is engaging work. And a group of 10 to 15 of members of Emerson, did more advanced work with a facilitator that I brought to Emerson by the name of Carolyn Steinhaus. And that work went on for about a year. I wasn't able to do that work myself. You see, I also believe in self-care, and there was a little project at Emerson going on about getting more space for our congregation. I think we did pretty well, but it was time-consuming, and it took my time and energy. My interest, though, in NVC continued. In the fall of 2014, Karen McClaskey came and offered another introductory workshop called The Cornerstones of Compassionate Communication, based on the principles of NVC. Before going on sabbatical, I studied with Karen. I asked her to coach me in teaching her workshop, and then I taught her workshop at the public library last June. She attended and gave me feedback. These are the tools that I took to Mexico City, where I then taught the cornerstones of compassionate communication to the volunteers who were there. It was a deeply profound experience. Here is what I learned and what I hope to do as we go forward. Nonviolent communication, or NVC, has a very clear objective and very well-defined strategies for meeting this objective. The objective, as I see it, is to maintain a positive connection with another person. Because when there is conflict, and remember that conflict is natural, but when there is conflict, there are healthier and non-confrontational ways to express ourselves than the patterns we often fall into. And equally important is the way we hear what others are expressing to us. Here's the difficulty that I have found with nonviolent communication. NVC is often taught as a formula, as a 4-part prescription to how we communicate. I found that the formulaic part of NVC to be cumbersome, and I found it to be a barrier to effectively using NVC. But what I believe to be the strength of NVC is that there is this set of strategies or skills, each of which will significantly alter any conversation you have. Just using one of these skills, don't worry about the 4, just using one of these skills will significantly alter how you are reacting, how you are responding, how you are communicating, how you are listening to another person, especially when there is conflict. That's what excites me. In the remainder of my sermon, I will talk briefly about these skills. But as I'll say at the end, don't say, oh, now I've heard all there is to know about nonviolent communication, because there's more. Again, these skills or components or cornerstones, I'll talk about them, describe them briefly, ever so briefly. And then I'm going to offer you a plan of how I plan to go forward with this work. The first cornerstone is learning how to speak in a way that does not include moralistic judgments of right and wrong. Invariably, when we are describing a situation that is causing us some angst, kind of upsetting to us, we are often going to use words. We fall into a habit of using words that will cast blame or criticism on another person. It is easy to do. I've been there. We all do it. Consider the difference between these two statements. I don't recall receiving a response to my email versus you didn't respond to my email. In an already tense moment, if we use the second statement, a listener will likely hear a criticism and become defensive. If you use the word always, you always, or you never, a person will become defensive. They will hear the criticism in the voice, guaranteed. This may then begin a downward spiral in a conversation, and we begin losing that important connection with the other person. Let me remind you of the objective of nonviolent communication. It is to maintain that positive connection with another person. And this first cornerstone says, don't go to the place of blame and criticism. The second cornerstone is to better understand our own feelings. Too often what we think are feelings are really stories that we tell to ourselves and then we tell them to others. There's an ancient parable of a man in a boat who saw another boat coming toward his. He got angrier and angrier at the person in the other boat who disregarded his warnings. It was only after the boats collided that he realized there was no one in the other boat. He may have been scared. That's the feeling. But that is quite different than the story he told himself and the anger he expressed. How often we begin to tell our stories about what is happening to us. It's also important to understand that our feelings come from within us, says Marshall Rosenberg. They do not come from outside of us. In other words, and this is important, two people can have the exact same experience and respond very differently based on our experience, based on our history. And so we have to understand that the feelings that we are having come from within us. We cannot blame others for how we feel. In fact, Marshall Rosenberg will say it is a violent act to say that another person makes you feel the way you do. The third cornerstone is to recognize that while we have legitimate needs in life, there are many ways to meet those needs. Too often we think that the only one way to meet our need, that there is only one way to meet our need, and that there is one individual who can meet our need. We may convince ourselves, and this often happens within couples, we often convince ourselves that we must change. I'll just have to change this one person's behavior just a little bit to meet my need. If I could just get them to not leave their clothes on the floor. Yeah. And yet the goal of changing another person's behavior is a recipe for failure. This cornerstone of nonviolent communication awakens us to the idea that there are many ways that needs can be met. The fourth cornerstone is to understand the difference between making requests and making demands. Too often we think we are making requests, but if the other person doesn't say yes or do as we have requested, we then become upset. And then it is oh so clear that we have just made a demand. There are other times when people will do as we have requested because they fear the consequences. Marshall Rosenberg will go so far as to say to another person, please only do as I have requested, if you can do so with the joy of a child feeding a hungry duck. If you do not have that joy, please do not do as I have requested. Imagine getting to that level of communication with another person. I cannot understate the value of making sure that our requests are just that, requests. Marshall Rosenberg has a lot to say about empathy. I call it the fifth cornerstone. Too often when there is conflict, we find ourselves playing a disastrous game of I'm right and you're wrong. Empathy means abandoning that game and instead trying to understand the needs of another person. You are suspending your own needs for the moment, and trying to hear what is alive in another person. You are trying to hear what they are feeling and needing. This is when there is conflict. Stated another way, empathy means never hearing a criticism. Wouldn't that be nice? Never hearing a criticism from another person, but trying to hear what they are expressing, even and especially if they are expressing it poorly. An exercise in nonviolent communication workshops is to think of a person who is angry at you and then try to guess what is their need that they are trying to express. This is hard work. And this last one, I'm not convinced I've ever done this successfully. If I have been successful, it's usually 6 months later. Never hear a criticism. Hear the need. Maintain the connection. When a person feels heard, they are then able to hear your needs as well. Marshall Rosenberg that says, when we are able to do this, it is then easy to find a solution to any conflict, a solution that meets both people's needs. And this is not a compromise. Rosenberg is very clear. It is finding a solution where everyone's needs are met. I've just offered a summary of what I believe are the cornerstones of nonviolent communication. As I've said, any one of them, I believe, can significantly change a conversation. Starting this first Sunday, the first Sunday in February, for the Adult Religious Education Hour, I will spend 5 consecutive Sundays showing part of the nonviolent communication video hosting Marshall Rosenberg, where he explains these ideas. Each Sunday morning we'll have 15 to 30 minutes of video followed by 30 to 45 minutes of explanation and exploration of his ideas in more depth. I'm using this approach because Marshall Rosenberg is funny. Are there people who have seen the video by Marshall Rosenberg? He's a funny guy. His insights are very profound, and he has delightful stories. So that's why I will use his words. And I want you to know him. He died last February. So we will use his videos to spark the conversation. In the write-ups you will see they will refer to the cornerstones of compassionate communication. I use the phrase compassionate communication because I like it, and to be honest, I'm not an authorized trainer in nonviolent communication, so I can't actually use that in the title of what I hope to be facilitating. And yet here is the important part. If you stop after the introductory work, it is unlikely that you will change any of the habitual ways that you communicate. And you are unlikely to change the stories that you tell yourself about what you think others are doing to you. And so starting in March, I will lead a midweek practice group on Thursday evenings. And it will be a safe place to share our mistakes. A safe place to share our mistakes, to learn from each other, and to put these skills into practice on a weekly basis. Why am I doing any of this? I'm convinced that Unitarian Universalism is not just a place to come and hear about a new idea. If you do that, you will never get out of your head. Unitarian Universalism is a religion of personal and spiritual growth. It is about connection at the heart, connection with ourselves, connection with others, connection with those with whom we disagree. Emerson's vision statement says that we strive to be a vibrant source of peace, hope, and healing. I believe the cornerstones of compassionate communication do exactly that. These skills I've mentioned seem simple enough, but they require daily practice. To me, they are aspirational, and we will spend a lifetime trying to embody them. The goal is not just to change how we communicate with words. I've seen people who choose the right words, but there's something else going on. Nonviolent communication is how we communicate with the heart. To communicate and connect lovingly and kindly with others, especially in the midst of conflict. For me, this is truly living the life divine. May it be so.